So I'd like to start today with a number of questions that you have all written and asked about. And with luck, I'll be able to keep an eye on the comments today. I'm hoping I'll be able to, because a lot of what I want to talk about today are questions that you've asked and that people have comments that I think would really add to the conversation. So let me start first of all with my usual disclaimer. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer. When I do these talks, they're different than my written stuff, because my written stuff I have time to sit and check every fact. I am doing these really off the cuff, a lot of these discussions, and I do not have a staff. I work alone, I do my own research, and I'm going to make mistakes. I will promise you only that I will do my very best not to, and that I will correct the ones I make. So here we go with some of your questions for this week that take into account the things that have happened during the course of this week. And of course, everybody is desperately curious about the United States Postal Service and what on earth is going on with that. And I have to say, I blame you all for the fact that I have just spent like 3 hours reading the congressional debates over the 2006 revisions to the post office laws. And they're really not as interesting as I was hoping they were going to be, let me tell you. I will also say that there was something interesting about them, and that is when you read material from before World War II in the congressional record, it's very much the meat of what's going on. The debates in Congress are written in such a way that their constituents can read what each member of Congress says and develop their arguments, and so they have something to go home with and that people are really involved with. By 2006, the congressional debates are this incredible love fest where each congressperson gets up and says, oh, you know, my colleague so-and-so did just the best job, and there's an awful lot of real dross to read in those. So anyway, it's all your fault that I read that I have been sitting in the other room reading the congressional record of postal debates rather than actually doing some of my real work for today. Anyway, the history of the post office is really important. It is something that comes up again and again in our debates today. People talk about the fact that the Constitution is actually mentioned, the post office is actually mentioned in the Constitution. It is one of the most important things in the early republic, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that unless you can communicate, unless every American has equal opportunity to communicate across our nation, certain people are going to get read out of our political system. And interestingly enough, the post office was designed to make sure everybody could have access to the things that were happening in their governmental headquarters. The federal government, of course, is what the Constitution is involved with, but the idea of having access to your legislators was crucial to the idea of a postal service. So from the very beginning, there's this attempt to tie the country together with a postal service. And of course, even before the colonials broke off into their own nation, Britain had its own postal service here in the colonies. And in my home state of Maine, there are actually, in some places, including in my hometown of Yarmouth, signs from the original Kings Road post office. The original standing stones are still there, which is kind of cool. And Benjamin Franklin actually was the Postmaster General under that for the King before the Revolution. Anyway, when it comes time to write a constitution, the colonials, who are about to become Americans, recognize that they need to make sure that all Americans have access to the same information. So what they do is they put together in the Constitution the power, they give Congress the power, as they say, to establish post offices and post roads. And a year later, in 1789, after the ratification of the Constitution, they they create a Postmaster General and make the Postmaster General subject to the president. And 4 days later, Washington goes ahead and nominates a Postmaster General, and we have our system up and running. Now, one of the things that's important about that, and I'll walk you through the rest of that, one of the things that's important about the idea of a postal service is that everybody should be able to use it. And the crucial piece to that, when you talk about, for example, our First Amendment rights and the right to say say anything without oppression from the government. That's not to say you can say anything anywhere. You can't come into my living room and I don't have to listen to everything you say there, but the state can't stop you from talking. But what's important about the post office is it recognizes that even if the state can't suppress your voice with a military power, for example, it could still silence you by making it so you don't have access to share your ideas more widely. So the post office is about information flowing from the governments to the constituents. It's also about people being able to share their voices equally without them being stifled by expense, for example, by having to use a private service that it makes it out of the reach for poorer people. So the post office is about the communication of political ideas, but it's also about access. And that idea of access is really important nowadays when we talk, for example, about the internet and whether or not we should have to pay different rates on the internet according to who we are. So that's a different rabbit hole that I won't go down today because I know you really want to know about the post office. So I'll keep on going. The Postal Service is vital in America, again, for this very reason. We think about writing letters to our family members, and of course that's very important in terms of our social ties. But the idea of being able to communicate about political issues was so important to people in the early republic and into the 20th century that Congress actually had a system called the franking privilege, which meant that if a congressman signed something, he could send it free through the mails, with the idea that this would enable him to keep his constituents apprised of what he was doing in Washington. And that's the way the system worked really until, I'm going to do a huge jump here, although the postal system in the 19th century is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to jump here until World War II. And what happens with World War II and in the wake of World War II is the Postal Service gets completely overwhelmed. Many more people moving around in the 1950s, moving because of the war effort. People are moving from the South and the East out to the West. People are moving around, and this postal system gets completely overwhelmed. Its buildings are old. There are too few people for the amount of work that has to happen. And at the same time, the pay in the postal department had stagnated after the war. And as it stagnated, white men tended to leave the post office, and people of color and women tended to come into post office jobs, and that's going to matter today. I'll explain why in a second. But when this happens, the Postal Service, the people who are working for the post office, as it was called at the time, the post office department, get more and more unhappy about their conditions. And after the 1960s, having watched so many different groups of people demand redress from the federal government for the way that the conditions under which they were living, postal workers in the 1970s struck. And when they struck, they forced the government to really take a look at the post office and to change a system that really was terribly outdated. And in 1970, we get the Postal Reorganization Act, which is the first major, and it's really a major overhaul of the Postal Service since almost its inception. Now, I know the premier historian of the Postal Service is a good friend of mine, and just so you know, you can probably hear his head exploding because I haven't done anything here on the 19th century when changes did happen. But for my purposes today, what we really care about is the 1970 Postal Reorganization Act, because that does a couple of major things. So what it does is, first of all, it gets politics out of the post office, because until then, to get a job in the post office, you basically had to have political connections. And what would happen is, a politician would make sure his friends got jobs in the post office. And so that meant, it was always really kind of about who you knew. It was sort of old-fashioned patronage in the post office department. In order to change that, they make it apolitical, and they give workers a much greater say than they have had before in the Postal Service. And crucially, it transforms the post office department into the United States Postal Service. That's a huge change. So USPS, as we know it now, the United States Postal Service, that's a product of this 1970 Postal Reorganization Act. It does something else really important for today. It makes the post office an independent establishment. It is no longer supported by tax dollars. I hope everybody got that. The Postal Service we have today is not supported by tax dollars. That changed in 1970 with the Postal Reorganization Act. What happened then is that it had to be able to stand on its own after 1970. So everything's hunky-dory, right? 1970, they've cleaned up the post office. It looks like everything's going to be great. Well, what happens in 1970? We get automation. We get really big automation. And when that happens, conditions in the post office go bad really fast. And I mention this because for a lot of people, we kind of think about the post office and we think about the 19th century and how corrupt it was, or we think about the present and can't quite figure out what was happening. But we've forgotten about the 1980s and what happened after the Postal Reorganization Act and after the automation of the 1970s. And what happens in the 1980s, and I think this colors the way a lot of people, certainly of my age, think about the Postal Service, is we get incredible workplace, what do you call it? Workplace anger, workplace, there's a word for it, when people in their workplaces, workplace rage. And we have a number of shootings in the 1980s. And in 1983, we get the concept of, and I'm so sorry to say this, but we get that concept of going postal. You know, this incredible workplace rage. And people got the sense in the 80s that something was terribly, terribly wrong in the Postal Service because of the frustrations of the workers there, because they were being asked to do so much because of automation, because things were moving so quickly. And we get this sort of cultural attitude of something really going bad in the post office. And I think somewhere that's in the back of our minds, even though that was really quite distinctive in the 1980s. And there was a lot of other violence in the 1980s because of so many changes in society at that time. But the Postal Service got to be the service really that carried a lot of the cultural weight of that. So what happens is that there's that feeling going to the 80s. There's also increasing desire in the 80s to privatize a lot of major industries. And the Postal Service is a really big deal. The Postal Service in that period employs about 800,000 people. It's a major employer. It still is a major employer, by the way. And it is responsible for a lot of our domestic industry, fairly high percentage, and I don't remember which. I'm gonna say like 9%, but that's completely off the top of my head. Somebody might correct me and say I'm completely out to lunch, but it's a major player in the American economy. So a lot of people who believe in privatization look at the Postal Service and start to salivate. They think this would be a really good place for private industry to step in and do it better, get rid of the anger that's there, maybe get more efficiency, more automation. And so it's on the chopping block. People are very aware of the fact that the Postal Service is there and maybe there for the taking, the way, for example, other industries are in the 1980s. So what happens is that people are talking about it, but man, no one wants to get involved in the post office because a post office is in everybody's town and everybody knows a postmaster or a postmistress and everybody loves and hates the mail, but it's kind of almost a third rail in American politics. So what happens is in the 2000s, of course, we get email. And email is going to make first-class mail drop. And a lot of the profits of the Postal Service have come from first-class mail. And as we switch over to email, they're going to be hurting for their to keep their budget balanced or to make money. And what happens beginning in the 90s really, and then in the 2000s is the Postal Service starts to raise rates on first-class mail pretty quickly. You may remember that period. It felt like every time you bought a stamp, it wasn't worthwhile. You know, you couldn't use the whole block of stamps before you had to add other 1 and 2 cent stamps. And this is when we really start using the forever stamps because people got so confused about how many stamps they had to put on a first class letter. So in 2000, beginning in the 2000s really, the Congress begins to talk about changing what's happening in the Postal Service. And the people who are behind that, it's a bipartisan effort, but it's really pushed by the Republicans. It doesn't really go anywhere for a long time until 2006. And after 2006, the Republicans are going to push through a new law called the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, the PAEA. And the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006 is really pushed in the House by Pete Sessions of Texas. And I had to mention this because those of you who follow my other political stuff will know that Pete Sessions is one of the people who took Russian money from Lev Parnas. There, I just had to put that in. And by the way, I mispronounced Parnas. I can't remember what it is, but it was interesting that Devin Nunes said it correctly when nobody had ever heard of him. He pronounced it correctly on an interview, something people have pointed to, despite the fact he said he didn't know him. He could pronounce his name correctly, unlike me. Anyway. So this Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006 is a major restructuring of the United States Postal Service. And the idea behind it was to make the USPS, as it was called, compete against the new commercial delivery systems that were really coming on in that period. UPS, for example, and Federal Express, as well as, you may remember, there were some other private mail carrying companies. I don't know what's become of them, but the idea was to make it compete with them and to on the one hand, and also to stop these rate hikes, because regular, ordinary Americans especially in rural areas, couldn't stand these constant rate hikes, and they started to complain to Congress that they were tired of having these rate hikes. So what happened under the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act was that Congress divided USPS carrying into two different categories. There was the mail that was most frequently used has a limit to how much they can charge on it. There's a group of people who decide how much you can charge for regular mail. But then there's the competitive side, and they can charge competitive rates on that side of the mail carrying side. And so the design was, as one of the Congress people said, as he said, this bill essentially allows the United States Postal Service to operate like a business, which will clearly benefit all Americans. But, you knew there's a but coming, there's always a but coming. But in that Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006, there was a requirement that the USPS had to prepay the health benefits for all of its retirees in advance for 50 years. You often see that as 75 years, but it was 50 years. But the problem was the payments were seriously preloaded. So it was a ton of money right up front. What this means is that the USPS is supposed to put about $5 billion a year into the future retirement benefits, the health benefits of its employees. Unlike any other business, or either in the government or private industry. So there is this requirement on the USPS to pre-fund the health benefits for all of its retirees for the next 50 years, unlike any other business or a government agency. So what does that mean? That means that before this went into effect, the USPS was in fact operating the black. It was making money every year. But once you had to prepay $5 billion a year in retirement benefits, that threw it into the red. And that's been the crisis over the USPS, the United States Postal Service, ever since. Right now, though, we're in a different, even a bigger crisis, because whenever there's a recession, there's a lot less first-class mail and a lot less junk mail for the USPS to carry. And so after 2008, the crisis of 2008, the amount of mail being carried by the USPS began to plummet. And again, that hurt the fact that it still had to pay its retirement benefits, and it was making a lot less money. And now, of course, we've got the problem of COVID-19, and that is hurting it even more. It's losing money hand over fist right now because of this pandemic. So what's going on, as you know, with President Trump saying that he wants to get rid of the United States Postal Service? So having given you that background, there's a couple of things going on. First of all, Trump hates the Postal Service because he believes it supports Amazon. It doesn't. What really happens is that the Postal Service works with Amazon to manage and with other large carriers to manage the delivery of all their packages, because it's not cost efficient for people like UPS or Federal Express to do the rural deliveries like where I live, So the USPS does that last mile, as they call it, and that's a system that works out for both parties. Trump hates Amazon because Amazon is owned by Jeff Bezos, who runs the Washington Post. And the Washington Post, of course, is highly critical of President Trump. But more than that, Trump is carrying on this tradition of privatizing this large, very important industry. You got to remember it's an industry. The USPS employs more than 500,000 people a year, and those people, as I say, are often people of color and often women, and especially the issue that this is an industry that is providing benefits to people of color is a sticking point for a lot of people who would like to privatize it. And a lot of people would like to get their hands on that business. They would also like to get their hands on the proprietary information that the USPS has about how to manage our deliveries, because of course they've been doing it for so long. They have a very good, very complicated system, and a lot of people would like to get their hands on that and to make money off it. And then finally, there is the issue of mail-in voting. And that, of course, is not something that's been on the table for a long time, simply because we are really looking at it at a national level because of this pandemic. That being said, if the USPS privatizes, the rural America will, first of all, have to pay a lot more money for the delivery of mail than urban America. And second of all, there goes the fundamental principle that everybody should have equal access to a communication system to tie a nation together and to make sure that some voices are not heard more than other voices. So there is the long thing on the US Postal Service. Interesting part of American history. All right, another question that somebody came up with is, yes, somebody just said Parnas. That's probably right, whatever it is. I pronounce it wrong because I only see it in print. And obviously Devin Nunes had heard it spoken and knew how to say it, even though he said he had never met the man. Anyway, another question. Somebody wants to know, somebody wants to know about third-party voting and what in America, is it worth the vote? Is it worth voting third party, or is voting third party in America a bad idea? Great question. And this is one that's going to piss off a lot of people, my answer to this. But I will tell you what I'm about to say is the common understanding among political historians and political scientists of America. This is only about America. If you're, from other countries, this answer might be very different. But in America, third-party voting almost always splits the vote and makes sure that the least popular candidate wins. And I could give you a lot of examples of this and how this happens. Really dramatically, of course, the election of 1912, when the two Republican candidates, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, split the Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson, who is perceived as a former Confederate, is elected. That's a very famous one, but more to our purposes today, I think, is the election of 1844. The election of 1844 is one lost to the sands of time for most people, but it's important because it is an election in which a group of progressives split off from a major party candidate because they didn't think he was pure enough, and they ended up tossing the election to somebody else and changing American history. So recently, when somebody asked to me if you had one, or to a number of us, if you had one election you could redo, which would it be? And most people were looking at like 2000 and recent ones, and I said it would be 1844. What happened then was that the Democrat James K. Polk, who was sympathetic to the spread of slavery, was running against a Whig, Henry Clay, who was himself a slaveholder from Kentucky, although he had come around to the idea of ending human enslavement. But he didn't think it could be done quickly, and he thought he had to bring along the Democrats to his platform. When he tried to compromise with the Democrats and tell other Whigs to vote with him, people who were staunchly anti-slavery, because of course this is not negotiable. I mean, human enslavement should not be negotiable. They left him. They left the Whig Party and they joined the Liberty Party. When they joined the Liberty Party, they took about I think it's about 2.3% of the vote behind a man named James G. Birney, who was advocating in 1844 for the complete abolition of human enslavement. When they did that, they threw, it's only 2.3% of the vote, right? They threw the election to James K. Polk. Why does that matter? Because James K. Polk worked actively to spread human enslavement across the continent. And he backed the Mexican-American War that brought all of the lower Southwest into America, and then his party backed the spread of slavery across the country. So this was a great example of a place where, you know, refusing to compromise on the issue of human enslavement, which is right, I mean, the decision was right, except what that did was it resulted in far more human enslavement. It's the precursor to the 1850s that spreads the worst instances of human enslavement and human abuses across America, across the country, in part, not in part, because of that vote. So if that's the case, it sounds like I'm against third-party voting. No, I'm not at all against third-party voting. Or against third parties is maybe a better way to put it. Because third parties have a really important role in America. It's just important to remember what that role is, as far as I'm concerned. Third parties are a really good way to get previously unappreciated principles woven back into the primary parties. As long as we have a two-party system, it's going to be extremely hard for third parties to get much traction at a national level. And I don't believe that there's going to come a time when we, at least in the short term, when we have more than two parties, for the simple reason that the machinery of those parties is so deeply woven into American society at both the local and the state, as well as the national level. It's really, really hard to rebuild that stuff and to get the sort of generational loyalty that you need to motivate people if you have a startup third party. That being said, if one of the two major parties dies, we will have a third party replacing them. That's another fascinating question that I'd love to get into at some point. But so long as we have the two-party system that we do, which we've had since the 1850s, 1856, I think we're stuck with the system we've got, which is certainly a way to think about it in the short term now. And the importance of a third party in this two-party system is that it brings in new ideas, and those ideas are either accepted by the major parties or rejected. And while many people are thinking about progressive parties right now, of course there are reactionary parties that try to do the same thing. We have the Dixiecrats in the American South in the 1950s and the 1960s. We have neo-Confederate parties, for example, trying to bring things in on the right. But if you're talking about the left, a great example to look at, and one of my favorite examples, is the populist movement of the 1890s. The populists took a look at a system obtaining in the East in the 1880s primarily, and said, you know, we have a huge problem. The oligarchs have taken over American society. The government is operating only for their good, not for the good of the people, and we must start a third party. And they speak well and they speak eloquently, although, mind you, there's some real kooks in the party. And if anybody's wondering, look up Ignatius Donnelly, one of my favorite characters in American history. They take a look at this and they say, we simply have to have a new party. And starting in the 1890s, a group of Westerners primarily starts to organize as the Alliance. And this is the group of people who featured farmers like Mary Elizabeth Lease, the woman who went across the plains saying that farmers should raise less corn and more hell. And they educate people about the monopolies in the East and about how Congress is responding only to the wealthy. And they get people energized, and they get people out to vote, and they get people talking about this stuff, and they get people caring. And they managed to elect so many of their alliance members to Congress in 1890. They go on to caucus with the Democrats, that the Republican Party, that is really in the hands of oligarchs at the time, loses control of the House of Representatives by a ratio of 2-to-1, and they are gobsmacked. They did not see it coming. Literally, Benjamin Harrison is reading, there's a letter in the Benjamin Harrison papers of somebody who has talked to Harrison. Benjamin Harrison is the Republican president at the time, after the election, and he's wandering around his garden going, what happened? What happened? I don't know what happened. And then he says, except I know it wasn't my fault, which should sound somewhat familiar. Anyway, they managed to get a lot of people energized. And in 1892, and then again in 1896, they organize as the People's Party, the Populist Party, and try to take over American government. Well, what happens is that the major parties look at them and try and undercut them. They try and either adopt their platform or ignore, or say you people are crazies. And what happens is the Democratic Party adopts their platform and really kind of takes the rug right out from under them. It leaves behind some of the craziness and takes all their terrific ideas about making sure that the rich don't take over American society. And by the election of Woodrow Wilson, when Woodrow Wilson is in office after 1913, the ideas that the populists had introduced in the 1890s, which sounded insane in the 1890s, were mainstream. And that's the benefit of a third party, is to energize people, to get them talking about stuff, to make things that seemed crazy suddenly seem not so crazy, and to bring them more fully into American society. So I get a little sad when people talk about their favorite candidate, and I'm not just talking about Senator Sanders of Vermont. You know, many people had characters, had people they loved who didn't make it the full way. Just because your candidate dropped out does not mean that your candidate's role is over. Those principles that person espoused are very much still viable and still should continue to be pressed. And again, the other thing to remember when you talk about third parties and you talk about the current system, it is also a huge problem to put too much emphasis on the president. And people get angry at me when I say that. The president certainly matters, but the president is really kind of the captain of a ship. What really matters is the team that president will gather around him or her. So, you know, you need to have what a president really needs to do. The real skill set a president needs to have is to be able to build coalitions. And that doesn't necessarily mean to build them by being all lovey-dovey. LBJ did a fabulous job bullying people, but has to be somebody who has enough pull that that he or she can get legislation through Congress, because at the end of the day, that's really what needs to happen. And you saw President Trump falling down so miserably on that with the passage of the third coronavirus relief package. He didn't even make a phone call, as near as anybody could tell, which suggests that he is really pretty much useless in trying to get legislation through. So everything has been tossed over to Mitch McConnell, who is really using his power simply to stop legislation rather than to put legislation through. So when you think about third parties, think about them as introducing new important ideas. And if the ideas are miserable, then they'll die. But if the ideas are good, they will get picked up. And also to think about third parties not as a do or die thing, but rather as, can my people become part of a coalition? You know, you elect enough people who embrace your ideas into Congress, people are going to have to compromise with them. They are going to have to make their voices heard. And that's just kind of the sausage making of doing legislation. I don't see that as a negative thing. A lot of people think that we should have sort of clean, almost dictatorial powers amongst the people we like. The reality is that if you do have to do this wheeling and dealing, you often come out with a mess, but it's a mess that keeps an awful lot of people happy. Of course, the other thing that is that would, in fact, change the equation I'm talking about when I talk about the dangers of third-party voting, splitting a vote and giving you the character you don't want. That's third-party voting. And third-party voting has been experimented with in Maine in, I think it was the last election. And I was an agnostic on third-party voting. It seems to have worked extremely well here in Maine, whereas the Democrats in Maine tend to split their votes between two fairly moderate candidates, putting the third person running in charge. And of course, that gave the state of Maine Paul LePage, who made an awful lot of people very angry. He was elected with about 40% of the vote. The other two candidates, of course, got 60%, which is a lot, and split it, giving him the vote. And this time around, Maine instituted ranked choice voting, which meant in one of the districts in Maine, a fairly LePage-like character named Bruce Polkwin fell to the somebody who won on ranked choice voting, a man named Jared Golden, a fairly conservative Democrat who is now enormously popular. So that seems to have worked out quite well here, and it's worth looking into ranked choice voting if you're interested in that. As I say, I think going into the next decade, there's going to be a lot of changes in the American election systems, and that very well might be one of them that's implemented far more widely than in small states like Maine. All right. Next question. That's third-party voting. Next question. Ned McDonald wanted to know if President Trump could use the Interstate Commerce Clause and laws about interstate commerce to force the states to open, because of course we're all wondering about what Trump is up to when he declares that the authority of the president to override the governors in issues of the coronavirus is absolute. Ned wants to know, is congressional authority to regulate the trade among states ceded to the executive during a state of emergency? That's a very good question, and it's a good question that highlights what Trump and what was going on yesterday that I wrote about last night. There is this kind of weird dance going on between the governors and the president, and it's a weird dance that brings in issues of federalism and issues of states' rights, and also issues of what the Republican Party has been up to for a number of years, trying to both dissipate the federal government, send the powers back to the states, and at the same time trying to increase the power of the executive. Those two things are at odds with each other, and I think it's really coming to a head. So what is happening right now when the West Coast and the East Coast governors have said they're making their own consortium to deal with whether or not they will, or when they will open after the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have eased a bit. What's happening with that is twofold. First of all, the president has made it very clear that he is not going to use the federal government to support the states. And for a long time, the states were trying to work with him, but they really got furious when they would try and order their own supplies, and then the federal government would take them. And the federal government apparently, I'm still looking into this, but apparently has come up with a system of a 50-50 split. They take 50% of what comes in and turn it over to private businesses to sell, and put 50% into places that they consider hotspots. But of course, it's not clear how they make those determinations, and it has really hit the news that often Trump seems to be simply giving ventilators to Republicans to help them out in key elections. And that, of course, is infuriating people who have gone ahead and ordered their own supplies only to have them taken. And that's happened disproportionately to Democratic governors, or so it seems. So when last week, when Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, said, I'm done. I'm gonna get this stuff on my own, and I might even export it to other states. He was saying he's not going to play nice anymore. He's not going to try and compliment the president to get stuff, because he's not getting it. So he's going to do it on his own. So when they announced yesterday that the 3 Western states and now a number of Eastern states have made their own consortia to decide what they were going to do about the pandemic, they are saying to the president, we are not going to do what you say. So that's a really big deal. But a number of people have said, are they seceding? Have they declared war on the federal government? And the answer to that is really clearly no. The way they have worded what they are doing is very clearly abiding by the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution reserves to the states all the powers that are not enumerated in the Constitution. So all the powers that have not been given to the federal government are reserved by the states. And one of those reserved powers is the right to determine the police powers and the health powers of their own states. And this is really pretty not negotiable. And they have been very clear. They're not saying we're going to do our own everything. They're saying we're going to abide by the 10th Amendment, and this is what we are doing. They are forcing Trump's hand in a way. It's a really interesting thing they have done, because he keeps saying he's going to go ahead and open the country. Well, what does that even mean? To open the country? Because what he can do, what the president can certainly do, is to require federal workers to go back to work. That's just not negotiable. Of course he can do that. But he can't do the states. And when you talk about this being a secession, and doesn't this look like exactly what the southern states did during the war? No, it's the opposite. during the Civil War, the southern states said to the deep southern states who initially seceded actually took into their control federal installations. They took over federal property, federal mints, for example, and eventually federal forts. And that's why they're firing on Fort Sumter in the mouth of Charleston Harbor. That's a federal fort. And they're saying we are going to take federal land under our own power and into our own control, rather, by the way, like the Bundys do out west. That's something that looks very similar to the Confederates, but it looks very different here, because what the states are saying is we're going to keep our own powers here, and we're not going to do what the deep southern states did. So that is very much the opposite of what was going, what the Confederates were doing. That being said, what is Trump up to? I mean, this is just a weird, weird place to pick a fight. And we know that he wants the economy to recover because he sees it as closely tied to his reelection prospects. But it's not going to do him any good to get the economy reopened if more people die, because then we're all just going to go right back into our holes and hide. So what is he doing? I would make a guess that what he is really up to, and mind you, the man has good political instincts for his base. He reads his base extremely well. My guess is what he is doing is he is playing to his base so that he can blame Democratic governors when the economy does not recover over the course of the summer, which very few people think it's going to do. He can point to the Democratic governors and say, see, I wanted to fix the economy, but the Democratic governors stopped me from doing it. For more questions on this, I will defer to Bobby Chesney, who is the Charles Francis Professor of Law at the University of Texas School of Law, who did a blog post today, I think it was today, I read it today anyway, for Lawfare, which is a great way to understand the legal decisions that are happening around us, or the legal things that are happening around us. I really recommend it. It's called Lawfare. It's nonpartisan. Lots of people write for it, and they're very, very smart. All right, so what he says is can the president do what Ned worried about, work around this by declaring an emergency? And he says, no. He says, first of all, there is no law that you can use to read in any way that the president can override the state governors on this issue. And he goes through the laws and he says, this doesn't count, this doesn't count, this doesn't count. Would Congress pass a law enabling him to do it? No. He says the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Democrats, wouldn't. I would go further and say that the libertarian-leaning Republicans in the Senate, people like Mike Lee of Utah, also would not go along with anything like this if they were asked to do it. But the third question is, could he inherently say that he can do it under the Article 2 powers, the idea that the president has the power to override what the states want to do on this issue? And he points out that, in fact, a president did try to do this. President Truman tried to do this in the midst of the Korean War when the steel industry went on strike. And he proposed using the federal government to override the strike under the emergency powers, because the steel strike was inhibiting the government's ability to produce arms and armaments to fight a war. I mean, this seems like a pretty good excuse for stepping in and using the federal government to override something happening within a state. And the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. They struck his ability to do that down. It actually had been done during the Civil War in the coal mines, but the Supreme Court said that Harry Truman could not do it during the Korean War in the steel industry. So again, I think what we're really looking at is much more about Trump trying to play to his base. And my guess is it will resolve itself either with him blustering or eventually with him saying that he decided to keep everything closed after all. Unclear how that'll play out, but he might try to do something. I think this is going to be, everything I read and everything I know suggests that that this is not going to be something he'd be able to do. All right. A couple of things I want to put together here finally. First of all, Sarah Kozan wants to know about what to say to people who insist that we are giving up our freedoms by having to stay home for COVID-19 and that we are now living in a police state. And I would go with that to the idea that has been part of American society really since the 1950s, and that really took off with the Reagan Revolution. And this idea is that if the federal government does something for regular Americans, for ordinary Americans, it is somehow communism. It is somehow a redistribution of wealth. And that idea really got sold in America after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, with the idea that the government being used in such a way that it protected ordinary Americans, their equal opportunity to an education, their equal opportunity, equal access to jobs, in this case, our protection from a deadly pandemic, that those things cost tax dollars. And those tax dollars are going to have to be paid for by hardworking white taxpayers, is how it was constructed from 1955 on, especially into the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. And what people who objected to these very popular pieces of legislation said was this was an infringement on liberty. Using the government to help ordinary people infringes on the liberty of business people who have to live by regulations and of taxpayers who have to give up some of their hard-earned money to help other people. And they always framed that as an issue of liberty, that human beings should have the liberty in America to do whatever they want to do, which of course is part of our political tradition, that we should have liberty. But the key piece of this idea is that giving people, I mean, the key thing to look at, this is an ideology, the idea that America depends on liberty, on everybody being able to do whatever they want to do is central to that idea that the government can't regulate, the government can't protect the basic social safety net, the government can't fund infrastructure. And that idea of liberty has a flaw in it, to my mind. I mean, people believe that, and there's a lot of people today who believe that. There's even probably somebody who's listening to this right now who believes that. But the problem with that fundamental idea of liberty is that invariably it means that a very few people take control, because a few people are going to get more than other people, and pretty soon they're going to control the political system, and pretty soon they're going to control the political system for themselves, and they're going to make sure they get everything. So in America, that idea of liberty has always been associated with a very few people taking power. And when people talk nowadays about how we are living in a police state if we permit the government to tell us to stay home, the government in this case is trying to protect Americans from what is proven to be a deadly pandemic. And I think skepticism of the government coming in and saying, you all have to stay home, is really healthy. We don't want, the government. We like being able to say to the government, we think you're wrong and here's why. But to my mind, and to that of epidemiologists everywhere, this is a deadly pandemic. And the government telling us to stay home is a way to keep us safe and healthy. And again, that idea of liberty, the idea that means people lose their freedom of movement. Yes, that's true, we do. But this is a case where, once again, a government stepping in is designed to level the playing field, if you will, rather than to permit some people to have control that other people don't. I'll point out that this whole idea of liberty really got a lot of teeth in America in the discussion of the first attempt to rework the American healthcare system under the Clintons, when people started to talk about death panels, that if the government got involved in healthcare, that they would have death panels that would kill grandma, because they would decide protocols for what kind of treatment people should get at certain stages in their lives, which most countries who have national health systems, by the way, do have. But of course, the alternative to death panels, as they called them, or these protocol panels convened by the government of disinterested people, is death panels by business, who get to decide if you have private insurance. They don't cover everything. They get to decide whether or not you are covered. And to me, that's a central question in these two philosophies of government. Would you rather have the messy, not always great, troubled, nonpartisan government agents figuring out what's best, or would you rather buy the best care you can get and have everybody else die, because most of us are going to be part of that everyone else. So the two systems have very different outcomes, and I happen to be on the side that says that unchecked liberty is going to create an oligarchy, and that I would much prefer to live under a system of democracy that regulates that liberty in such a way that it promotes the greatest good for the most of us. All right. Finally, I wanted to, as always, to leave on a happy note, or at least an interesting note. Deb Thalassatitis, I hope I pronounced that right, Deb, asked a question about where we are right now with the economy. The International Monetary Fund is stating that this recession in the midst of COVID-19 is going to be on the order of the Great Depression. That's true, they are saying that. What does that mean? How are we similar now to the 1930s, and how are we different? And where do I think that this is going to come out? Well, this is a fabulous question, because to my mind, we are looking right now very much like the end of the 1920s and the crash that led to the Great Depression. And that's fascinating to me, because when that crash happened, we are very similar in the 1920s to where we are in the present, in the sense that for all the talk about how great the economy has been since the 1980s, but certainly since the 2008 recession, for all that talk about how great everything is, you know, it hasn't been great for everybody by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, since 1981, and every single chart will show you this, what has happened in our economy is that very few people have gotten very, very rich indeed, and the rest of us have moved considerably downward. So from 1933 through 1980, we had what economists call the Great Compression, which was people's earning power and people's wealth compressed so that most people were in a band. Now, that's not to say it was entirely equal. Obviously, people of color didn't do as well as white people, and women didn't do as well as men, and there's all kinds of caveats to that, but we were in this Great Compression, as it was called. After 1981, we get what's called the Great Divergence, in which all of a sudden the split happens and wealth starts moving upward dramatically. And you see this, I say, in every single chart. But that's not the way people responded to it, because popular culture and political leaders talked about how good everything was getting. You know, we're making America great again, which, by the way, was a tagline from Ronald Reagan. Trump pulled it up from Reagan. It wasn't the other, you know, it wasn't original to Trump. The idea that, you know, finally, after the stagnation of the 1970s and all the problems of the 1970s, America was taking off and everything was just hunky-dory. Well, tell that to African Americans. Tell that to American Indians. You know, tell that to women. Things were not getting better for all of those people. And what's happened with this crash is very much like the crash of after the 1920s. The 1920s said the same thing. Everything's great. We got silk stockings. We got cars. We got radios. We got refrigerators. We got washing machines. Things are terrific. Well, things were terrific if you were part of that group of people who were reading the popular magazines and who are being served by this new booming economy that was injecting money into a very small segment of the population. When you got the great crash in 29, and now that's the wrong way to put it, now because of COVID-19, the facade has been ripped off that. And we're looking and saying, oh my dear, we've got a real problem here in this country. We have people working jobs they can't quit, because they can't protect it, because they can't they can't go without a paycheck. Unlike other countries, this is a real problem. We have to do something about healthcare, because people can't get tested for a pandemic disease because they can't afford to, and so they're spreading it to everybody else. And this recognition of the fact, most dramatically, that our essential workers are the ones who are at the bottom of our society and who are not making sufficient money to lead a healthy, prosperous lifestyle without working 3 jobs and even still not having money in the bank to pay a $400, as the recent study showed, a $400 emergency expense, is not sustainable. It is not sustainable. The same way it wasn't sustainable in the 1920s. Now, the 1920s crash was precipitated by the fact there was no regulation of the stock market, and because of the fact that GNP had increased dramatically, but the the benefits of it had gone to the top and not to the workers, so they didn't have any buying power. So it was not precipitated by something like a pandemic, but it did reveal the same thing, that we had this fundamental crisis in American society. So we have a huge advantage, though, over them. So one of the things I always say when I teach the crash is, I have this sneaking fondness, or sympathy at least, for Herbert Hoover, who was a great engineer and who, after all, fed Belgium during World War I, which is no small feat. He didn't know what to do. We didn't have the concept of deficit spending. We didn't have the idea of the federal government as anything other than a collective of the different interests in society. We didn't have the concept of it being somehow its own entity that could regulate the economy through things like financial policy, monetary policy, which, by the way, the Federal Reserve is doing so dramatically right now. We didn't have the idea of needing to regulate the new financial instruments that were available in the 1920s. And we certainly didn't have the idea that the federal government had a role to step in and provide a basic social safety net and promote the health of industries across the country through regulation, and, as I say, through the social safety net, and of course through promoting infrastructure. So the man's flying blind. They don't really understand Keynesian economics yet. Keynes really is, I'm not even sure he's writing in the 30s. He's certainly not going to be popularized until the 40s, and not really understood until the 60s. So he doesn't know what he's doing. What happens then, of course, is you get FDR in office, and FDR, speaking of flying by the seat of your pants, I mean, he's like, we're just going to try something, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And Eleanor at one point is like, I don't know if we're going to be able to pull this off. And somebody said, and I'm not going to get the quote entirely right, somebody said to FDR, if you pull this off, you will go down in history as the greatest president ever. And he said, if I don't pull it off, I will go down in history as the last president ever. So he knew he had to do something. And what he nailed together by hook or by crook, through the use of intelligent aides and people arguing, and he, he would do famous things like he'd get two guys come in, and one guy would say, let's do this, and the other guy would say, let's do the opposite, and he would literally put them in the same room, and he wouldn't let them come out to go to the bathroom or to have lunch until they agreed, which always amuses me. Anyway, he figured out that America had to create a new kind of government to face what is essentially a new industrialized national economy. And that is one that became known as the liberal consensus that I talk about so much. It was accepted by both Republicans and Democrats, the idea that the federal government had a role to play in regulating the economy so that employers did not abuse their workers, and that every American could work hard and rise, and to provide a basic social safety net for those who were not capable of protecting themselves as they grew older primarily. That's how we get Social Security. But as they are disabled or unable to work. And finally, that the government really has a role to play in promoting infrastructure. And it's really Eisenhower who takes off with that after World War II, because Eisenhower recognizes that we need to create a rising standard of living, or else face the problem of creating a group of people who feel disaffected, who feel that they're left out of American society, and therefore are susceptible to the rise of a demagogue who will promise to take them back to an era in which they had relevance, and will urge them to attack their fellow Americans in order to do that. Ahem. Eisenhower was a very smart man. So now we know that. So now we know what to do. We know, and by the way, this was not, while FDR spoke for the people, the lower rungs of American society in the 30s, he was not overturning capitalism, he was regulating capitalism. And much of the call for the regulation of the financial markets comes from actual stockbrokers and entrepreneurs who want to break into this new system and can't, because the stock exchange is all being run by who you know. You get a tip off, and all of a sudden you can make investments that nobody else knows are going to be good, and suddenly a few people are running the stock market for their own good, and regular people can't get in. Ahem. Kelly Loeffler looks very much like this right now, a senator from Georgia who appears to have used inside information to buy and sell stocks around COVID-19, and her husband is the president of the stock exchange. Anyway, we have these moments that this moment looks very much like the 1930s did, but now we know what to do. The question is, how do we get a president, a leader who will do that? And the answer to that is to do exactly what you are doing. Make noise. You know, call not just presidents and congressmen, but newspapers, your local government, your regular people. Say, this is what we need. You know, we need to have health care so that people can afford to stay home and not get everybody else sick. We need to have a basic coverage of wages during depression so that the entire bottom doesn't fall out of the economy. And we need those things. And I think even Republicans now recognize that. If you look at the last COVID relief bill, of course, this is deficit spending. They are pumping money into the economy, but they're doing it at the top. The question is, how do we get them to do it to the bottom? And this brings us full circle again to, for example, the protection of the post office. The post office employs more than 500,000 people. The Congress is refusing to bail it out. Hospitals provide jobs, aside from everything else. Hospitals provide jobs for millions of people. Health and for healthcare workers, you know, millions of people are involved there, and they are not being propped up under the deficit spending and under that activist government system that was first pioneered by FDR and later picked up by Eisenhower. I feel like this is the moment that we could, in fact, go back and go forward to a new kind of liberal consensus, if you will, shared by both Republicans and Democrats, that the government has a role to play in leveling America's economic playing field. I've thought it was coming for a long time. Maybe the pandemic really will get us there once and for all. All right, I hope that was useful. It's an hour, it's enough. And once again, thank you for coming. I will be doing the history talk on Thursday at 1 o'clock. The idea was to make this hour just before the news and the other hour midday as if it were a class. I will be doing that at 1 o'clock on Thursday if you want to join me there, where we will be picking up Reconstruction, my favorite era. Again, those talks are based on the new book, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. But if you have more questions about this, remember about the history and politics stuff, remember that I do these at 4 o'clock on Tuesday, and I'm always happy to take questions. I keep a running list during the week. Thank you very much. With luck, I'll see you next week.